Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. As usual, we're going to dive right into things here and take a look at the description of one of our items. Adela's Blood, the blood offering of Adela, nun of the Healing Church. In addition to recovering HP, for a set time, HP will continue to recover further. The nuns of the Healing Church, chosen in order to harbor excellent blood, are cultivated holy women of blood. That offering is a symbol of the Healing Church and the value of reception. So obviously that last line has seen some changes in the official translation. Rather than describe Adela's blood as the symbol of the value of the Healing Church and communion, it's described as something that lends those things legitimacy. It's not even the blood itself, but the mere chance of being treated with it that is described as having this effect in the official English. This is pretty clearly something of a leap, but it's one that I think emphasizes the same implication that was being made in the Japanese. To demonstrate this, let's think about what it means to be a symbol of something. In this sense, we're talking about something concrete that stands in for a more abstract concept. In other words, the blood of a blood saint is a specific item that represents the concept of communion and the Healing Church in general. By giving people this tangible representation of what they stand for, then, the Healing Church ends up gaining legitimacy, and one need not receive the blood directly for them to gain the benefit of that legitimacy. Again, I do think there's a bit of an interpretive leap being made here, but it's an evocative one that I think is fully in line with the spirit of the original text. On the other hand, there's another change being made here that I'm not sure works out quite so neatly. It's something that essentially gets skimmed over in the opening line. In the official English translation, this item is described simply as blood taken from Adela. The Japanese is a bit more descriptive though, referring to this as the blood offering of Adela. The terms used here may sound familiar too, since the phrase employed in Japanese is hodokoshi no chi. The reverse of the phrase chi no horokoshi that we discussed in an earlier episode as an offering of blood. In other words, this isn't merely blood that we've taken from Adela. It's a blood offering that we've received from her. Given that the term is emphasized with a set of quotation marks in the Japanese, this seems like it's the kind of thing that would be important in the world of Bloodborne. It's also perhaps significant that this term is employed both for the blood of Adela and for the blood of Ariana, but no mention of it is made in regards to regular blood vials or the Yosefka's blood vial. There's something about these offerings of blood that makes them stand out, and it may not even be something developed naturally on the part of those offering them. Recall that in both the English and the Japanese versions of the description for Adela's blood, the women selected to become blood saints are groomed for the role because they make good vessels, strongly implying that something is done to them in order to develop their blood into something extraordinary. To be fair, there are a lot of other indicators that the blood of Adela and the blood of Ariana are special offerings of blood without there needing to be specific terms for them, but it is interesting to me that they're given that treatment in the Japanese, but not the English. I feel like the idea that the people of Yharnam regularly deal in blood offerings, with all the religious connotations of that phrase, comes through a bit more strongly in the Japanese as a result. But speaking of fashionable practices in the world of Yharnam, why don't we turn our attention now to a piece of attire? Top hat. Hat of hunters who love a gentlemanly style of beauty. Like with the trick cane, certain hunters give great weight to beauty of form. To them, whether it be beauty of form, beauty itself, or justice, such principles are what it's like to be human, and reminders that keep hunters human. This, as you can see, is a fairly straightforward translation, but it does involve some interesting Japanese terms, one of which I wanted to highlight. And that would be the word yoshikibi, which in my literal version I've rendered beauty of form, and that officially appears as form or formality. The original concept is a bit complicated here, as it involves not just beauty or formality, but beauty of form. To break down the Japanese term then, we have first yoshiki and then bi, form and then beauty, respectively. The yoshiki part refers to a style or set of characteristics shared by a certain group. For instance, the yoshiki, or form, of a Gothic cathedral would include points such as that the structure be made of stone with large expanses of glass, and that it feature flying buttresses, pointed spires, and vertical arches. When we add be or beauty to this then, we're talking about a kind of beauty specific to the formal characteristics of whatever form, yoshiki, we're talking about. The yoshikibi of a Gothic cathedral might lie in its perfectly executed vertical arches, for instance. Again, this is not simply about looking pretty, it's about beauty of form. The nice thing here is that in the case of Bloodborne, the form in question is not Gothic architecture, but gentlemanly attire. In other words, formal wear. This means that when the Japanese literally describes a hat for hunters that love beauty of form when it comes to gentlemanly attire, the official translation can simply say that they admire formality and have it work in English. By the way, keep this alien corpse with human hands in mind. It's going to tie in with a point I intend to make in a future episode. But to finish the point I was making before, this overlap between formal attire and formal characteristics in art really simplifies what could have been a tricky issue in the English, and I appreciate the translation team was able to see this and make good use of it. You can actually see them play with the meaning from line to line. But before we go any further...
Moonlit scents. How did you worm your way in here? Very unfortunate. I had such high hopes for you. Well, I won't make any excuses. Would you mind leaving us alone? Things need not change. You'll do the rescuing, and I'll do the saving. But if you refuse to leave... Oh well. I've always wanted to try my hand on a hunter.
Seems like our Yosefka impersonator has been conducting some potentially disturbing experiments, though for the most part, I'd say that the translation here is anything but disturbing. Her lines generally come across with just the right level of self-assurance and insinuation, fitting the tone perfectly and definitely conveying a similar impression in the English as is present in the Japanese. That said, there's one particular translation choice I don't think works quite as well. There's one point where the official English line is, "Well, I won't make any excuses. Would you mind leaving us alone?" In Japanese, this is worded a bit differently, so my more literal translation is, "If you realize the significance of what you've seen now, could you please just turn back?" These lines are not without their shared characteristics. In either case, Impostor Yosefka is unapologetic and uses a question to essentially tell us to leave. By the way, just to point out where we are, this room is the same one where we woke up at the start of the game. That note was the same handwritten scrawl, and this item is new. Back on the subject of Impostor Yosefka's line telling us to leave though, while it may not come across particularly well in my more literal translation, the line is in no way meant to come across as a true entreaty. Still, I feel like the Japanese does contain some added nuance as a result of her referring to the significance of what you've seen. It drives home the idea that Impostor Yosefka really believes her work to be worthwhile, something that common people might reject, but only because they're incapable of seeing its true worth. The line also reinforces Impostor Yosefka's complete self-assurance, but that's something the rest of the official translation I think adequately conveys. The thought that we might see her work, realize her significance, and leave her to it doesn't quite come through here the way I would expect it to. That said, there are other places in the translation where that sense does come through, and more clearly in the official English than it does in the Japanese. For instance, if you attack the door where you first encounter her 3 times, she begins her response with the phrase, "Can't anyone comprehend?" Meanwhile, according to the lore translation guide I've been following, her corresponding Japanese line is merely about how we've failed to live up to her expectations. This strikes me as essentially the same situation in reverse, which makes me curious as to why they wouldn't include this line of thinking in the translation of the scenario we just encountered. But I don't want to focus exclusively on the puzzling aspects of this set of lines. There are some really nice touches on display in this translation as well. My favorite of these is probably the final line that actually involves words and not just creepy laughter. Here, my literal translation is, "Oh, but I suppose a clinical trial of a hunter is hard to obtain," with the official translation being, "Ah well, I've always wanted to try my hand on a hunter." And at first glance, this may seem out of place, but let's think about what's going on in the full context of the line. This is what Impostor Yosefka says after asking us to leave, implying that if we don't turn back and leave her in peace, bad things will happen to us. She's using insinuation to imply that she intends to experiment on us, and does so by letting us know that a hunter as a test subject is quite rare. Every aspect of this is echoed in the English, from her reliance on insinuation to make her threat, to the idea that hunters are unusual as test subjects. What I like about the English line, though, is that it emphasizes the threat by making her intentions of experimentations a bit less clear. When she says, "I've always wanted to try my hand on a hunter," it's pretty clear from the game context that she means to try her hand at experimenting, but the phrasing itself could imply that she means to try her hand in battle against us. And if we'd continued to advance up that staircase, we would indeed have found ourselves in battle. So this sounds natural, preserves the original meanings, and emphasizes the threat while foreshadowing a potential outcome. Hey Alfred, don't you think that's great?
Oh, good to see you safe. Now, let's think up something to discuss. Just tell me what piques your interest.
Ah, forget it. You didn't answer my question.
I bid you farewell. It has been a pleasure. May the good blood guide your way.
Alright, never mind. Let's chat.
There must be oodles for us to share. Go on. Just tell me what piques your interest.
So, what can you tell me about these Vilebloods?
Ah, there's something I want to tell you. A bit of wisdom from the eminent master Logarius. Once, a scholar betrayed his fellows at Bergenworth, and brought forbidden blood back with him to Canehurst Castle. It was there that the first of the inhuman Vilebloods was born. The Vilebloods are fiendish creatures who threaten the purity of the Church's blood healing. The ruler of the Vilebloods is still alive today, and so, to honor my master's wishes, I search for the path to Canehurst Castle.
Okay, anything else I should know?
In his time, Master Logarius led his executioners into Canehurst Castle to cleanse it of the Vilebloods. But all did not go well, and Master Logarius became a blessed anchor, guarding us from evil. Tragic times. That Master Logarius should be abandoned in the accursed domain of the Vilebloods. I must free him, so that he may be properly honored in martyrdom.
Okay, yeah, good luck with that. I'll see you around.
I bid you farewell. It has been a pleasure. May the good blood guide your way.
So clearly there are a lot of things to talk about here, but I'd like to start by revisiting one aspect of Alfred's lines I originally discussed back in episode 11. Recall that when he says, "May the good blood guide your way," a more literal translation might be, "May you have the divine protection, or divine favor, of blood." In that earlier episode, I pointed out that "May the good blood guide your way" has more of a religious feel to it. It simply sounds more like the type of phrase one believer might say when parting with another on good terms. I also then went on to say that the phrase tied in nicely with Alfred's storyline, and now I think that's become a bit clearer. Alfred, it turns out, is all about getting vengeance on those of the lineage of impure blood. Making his character emphasize that we go with the favor of good blood, then, strikes me as a nice touch. As for the jump from divine protection to guidance, there's another potential double meaning at work here. On the one hand, saying something along the lines of, "May the good Lord guide your way," seems to me like a reasonable way for a religious person to express their hope that a fellow believer go with the protection of God. On the other hand, Alfred is literally looking for a way to get to Canehurst Castle. Maybe he's hoping the good blood will lead him there to fight the Vilebloods. But that particular line is one we've spent at least a little time discussing before. I'd like to focus now on a few new lines we just got. First and foremost, something that jumps out at me is that in the Japanese, Alfred says that he searches for the path to Canehurst to inherit the will of his master. Even more literally, he's saying he does this to inherit the dying will of Logarius. This language should sound familiar. Recall that literally, blood echoes might be translated as the dying will of blood. It is through channeling the wishes of the dead that remain in the blood that hunters gain strength. Also, the stronger the will to be found in the blood, the more likely that will is to have been insane. Frenzied cold blood yields greater rewards than thick cold blood, or cold blood do, after all. When Alfred says he is acting to honor his master's wishes then, the Japanese gives players an indication first that by inheriting the will of his forebears, he's acting as a hunter traditionally does, and second, that he and his master might be a little unbalanced. As we've seen before, this is much harder to convey in the official English, but I do think the translation makes use of about as effective a phrase as it can. This brings me to the final point I wanted to make in this episode, which is about a phrase similarly difficult to render into English. In one of his lines, Alfred talks about how his master became a blessed anchor, and this struck me as kind of an odd turn of phrase, so I looked up the corresponding Japanese. Sure enough, there's a tricky term being used here. The original is sukui no omoshi, with the more difficult portion of the phrase being the term omoshi. According to my Daijisen Japanese dictionary, this can refer metaphorically to a force or person that suppresses someone. It generally has a positive connotation from what I found, with the idea that this can be a person or practice that helps you remain centered despite the chaos of your thoughts or emotions. So literally, this is a weight or suppressant of salvation. I think the idea is that Martyr Ligarius himself is acting to keep the forces of the Vilebloods suppressed. Ultimately, I can see why a blessed anchor guarding us from evil would sound compelling. Until next time then, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, please don't hesitate to let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone.